What follows was never meant to be spoken beyond the hushed alcoves of forgotten Libraria. It is the story of Bahani, once named 129 Tai D by the Tallimasters of the Administratum, a designation as bloodless as the cogitator runes that birthed it. Yet the men and women brought there by the Imperium's hand called it otherwise. They named it Bahani, meaning blue, for its oceans spread wide as a sapphire jewel, its skies soft with winds that promised fruit and grain. In those first years of colonization, they believed themselves chosen. The planet was not a hardship to be endured, but a gift granted, a quiet paradise held forth by the Emperor in his hidden mercy. The first settlers, indentured by debt or conscription, did not curse their fate when their transports descended through Bahani's mist-veiled atmosphere. They thought themselves rewarded, for here the seas ran endless, and the soil yielded its abundance without cruelty. They built shrines upon the shorelines, crude structures of driftwood and stone, and they whispered prayers of thanksgiving. Even the administratum clerks, hardened by the tedium of record and tithe, began to refer to the world not as 129 Tai D, but by the name their labourers had given it. But in the Imperium, there is no paradise unbroken, and no resource left untouched. Soon the quiet harvest of Bahani was turned to harsher purposes. Orders came from distant segmentum commanderies, and with them the designs of the Mechanicus. Vast vapour ships were crafted to trawl the seas, their engines consuming oceans to extract mineral bounty from the waters themselves. Mines tore into the bedrock, smelters filled the air with the taste of iron, and foundries scarred the once lush plains. The very land that had been a promise of grace became a crucible of labour. The people of Bahani adapted. They had no choice. Their ancestors built the first mega-processing plants, monolithic stacks of steel that reached like spears into the clouds. Generation upon generation was bound in service, their bodies claimed by the indenture that had delivered them to this world. What began as gratitude calcified into endurance. To serve, to toil, to evaporate the seas and dredge the minerals, it became not simply labour, but identity. Whole guild clans were forged in the sweat of factories, each bearing its scars as both shame and pride. Children were taught that their blood was the mortar of imperial might, and priests of the ecclesiarchy wove this submission into sermons. Still, the memory of blue lingered. Stories were told in the lower hab blocks of the days when oceans stretched to the horizon, when winds were not laced with grit, when fruit grew unbidden in the fields. These stories, forbidden but never wholly extinguished, became the inheritance of the poor. To dream of Bahani as it had once been was an act of defiance, whispered from parent to child like contraband hope. Millennia turned. The seas diminished, boiled away by the ceaseless engines. The winds grew harsh, heavy with salt and dust. The once fertile land cracked beneath its people's feet, and the only life that endured was life bound to industry. The grain fields lay fallow, and food had to be brought by ships from other systems, for Bahani itself no longer produced enough to feed its own. The dream of abundance had become a dependency, yet through it all, the people worked. For they believed, or had been made to believe, that this was their sacred burden. The Emperor had given them a paradise. The Imperium had taken it, remade it, devoured it, and still, they endured. A question lingers here, like a wound that does not close. When the first settlers bent their knees on Bahani's shore and whispered thanks to the Emperor, did he hear them? Or did their voices vanish into the void, already forgotten before the first ocean boiled away? From the moment the vapour ships began their endless passage, Bahani's fate was sealed. These vessels, taller than cathedrals and broader than mountain ranges, prowled the seas with a single, merciless purpose. Their engines did not rest, their furnaces did not cool, and with every cycle the waters were undone. Oceans dwindled, not as a gradual waning, but as an accelerated harvest, reduced to steam so that trace minerals might be drawn forth for the manufacturums of other worlds. Where once waves had rolled in majesty, there remained only voided basins, vast hollows, where silence lingered heavier than stone. The labourers remained bound to their toil. Generations were born into servitude, inheriting the contracts of their ancestors as though they were bloodlines. They carried numbers rather than names in the ledgers of the administratum. The pulse of their lives was not measured by harvest or season, but by quota and yield. The factories, raised in the first centuries as marvels of industry, had swollen into fortresses of smoke and fire. They were no longer merely structures, but entire cities devoted to a single task: the transmutation of a world into raw material. Bahani itself began to choke beneath the weight of its own exploitation. Dust storms raged across the emptied plains, their force sharpening the very winds until habitation outside the manufactoria became near impossible. Food no longer came from Bahani's soil, for the soil had long since ceased to give. Nutrition was shipped from other systems, rationed in blocks indistinguishable from the promethium casks and ingot shipments they accompanied. To live was to eat the product of another world, at the mercy of schedules determined light years away. Yet the people did not abandon memory. In the hidden places of the worker habs, carved figurines of saltstone depicted forms long associated with sea and sky. These crude icons were neither sanctioned nor forbidden, but they bore silent testimony to what had been lost. Families passed down tales of waters that stretched without end, of fruit-bearing orchards, of breezes that carried life rather than dust. Such stories became heresies of hope, recited as prayers in the dim glow of failing lumen strips. The administratum's gaze remained fixed only on yield. When outputs faltered, quotas rose. When famine struck, demands did not abate. Those who governed from orbit or afar saw only numbers, not the diminishing flesh of their subjects. To endure was the expectation. To fail was to invite censure. The ecclesiarchy endeavored to sanctify this slow suffocation. Its priests thundered from pulpit and vox alike that the emperor tested Bahani as ore is tested by flame. They declared that the oceans had not been lost but had been offered, transformed into the invisible strength of the wider Imperium. To labour was to worship, to wither was to prove fidelity. Yet even these sermons faltered in the mouths of starving clerics who themselves could no longer recall the scent of orchards or the taste of sweet grain. Thus, the centuries ground on. Bahani's seas were gone, its plains cracked, its winds weaponized against its own people. And still the labour continued, as though the very act of endurance could hold back the collapse that all foresaw. Beneath every chant, behind every sermon, one question stirred unbidden in the marrow of the people. If nothing remains to be given, will the Imperium remember us? Or will even our name be erased when the last yield is taken? The end did not come with bombardment or invasion. No enemy fleet darkened the skies. No demonic host broke the veil. Bahani's ruin came by decree, issued in distant chambers where its name was no more than a forgotten line upon a parchment scroll. When the last reserves of resource had been drawn from its oceans and bedrock, when the yield of labour could no longer justify the cost of import, the Imperium's gaze turned elsewhere. Orders were passed, signatures affixed, and a world was written off as one writes off a broken tool. The final fleet descended with cold precision. Its holds were not filled with grain to ease famine, but with space to bear away the remaining administratum officials, their archives, their cogitators, their instruments of extraction. Machinery was dismantled, loaded into transports, and secured for transit to some new frontier where the process would begin again. For a time, the people of Bahani watched in silence, confused but compliant. They had endured every command until now. Obedience was their inheritance. Then truth spread. Word reached the hab blocks and factory levels that evacuation would not be granted to the many, but only to the few. Administrators and overseers were guaranteed passage. A fraction of the labourers, chosen for skill or pliancy, were marked to be transplanted into service on other worlds. But for the millions whose hands had built the vapour ships, whose lungs were scarred by centuries of dust, no place was reserved. The supply ships ceased their deliveries. The grain no longer came. Famine was no longer a spectre, but a sentence. Rage followed. Protests rose within the hab complexes. Marches formed at the gates of the administratum compounds. Voices that had whispered only memory and endurance now cried betrayal. Riots erupted, fed by hunger and despair. Overseers were dragged into the streets, some torn apart by hands calloused from centuries of work. Assassinations struck officials in their quarters, vengeance delivered in the very shadow of shrines once raised to honor the emperor. Order fractured, for loyalty had been repaid with abandonment. Yet even in collapse, desperation found form. Hundreds volunteered for service aboard the Navy vessels themselves, offering their lives in the lowest decks, where mortality was certain, but survival possible. They would stoke the reactors, scrape the bilges, carry the dead into void warrens, anything, so long as it was not the certainty of starvation upon Bahani's husk. In the calculus of despair, death in the void was judged mercy beside death at home. And so the last fleet departed. Its engines roared, carrying away officials, machines, and a chosen remnant of labourers who would vanish into anonymity among the void-born masses. The skies cleared, and silence fell heavier than any bombardment. The world lay abandoned, its population condemned to dwindle in hunger, its oceans gone, its soil ruined, its name little more than a whisper in forgotten archives. Bahani, once called Blue, had become a grave where millions starved beneath the dust of their own labour. The Imperium did not return. No relief fleet came, no saint rose, no miracle descended. The planet lingered in agony, its people fading as shadows fade with the setting of the sun. And then only silence remained. Bahani's fate is not singular. It is not a tragedy set apart, preserved in amber as a warning. It is one of countless names spoken briefly and then erased. The Imperium is vast, and within its expanse lie innumerable Bahanis, worlds that gave until nothing remained, and when nothing remained, were cast into abandonment. The creed of mankind's empire is survival at any cost, and cost is measured not in oceans or grain, not in children's lives, but in quotas and shipments tallied across the stars. The lesson of Bahani is harsh in its clarity. The Imperium does not forget because it is cruel. It forgets because it cannot remember. 1,000,000 worlds cannot all be preserved, and so the ledger decides. Resources are finite. Administrators act as if sacrifice is infinite. When the final drop is drawn, the world itself becomes irrelevant. Bahani was blue once, but in the eyes of terror, it was never more than a designation. 129 Tai D. That is why silence followed its abandonment. No bard of the Ministorum composed lamentations. No fleet was dispatched in pity. Only the dust and the wind bore testimony to the people's end. Yet we who study such fragments must ask, could it have been otherwise? Robert Gilliman, in his second rise, has spoken of stewardship, of duty to the lives beneath the Imperium's banners. Would he have chosen differently? Had Bahani fallen within his view? Some argue he would have remembered that his ultramar is testament to guardianship as well as dominion. But even Gilliman cannot alter the iron machinery of empire, not when that empire is fed by 1,000,000 demands more urgent than compassion. Perhaps he could not have spared Bahani, even had his heart bled for it. And so the larger truth looms. The Imperium does not merely abandon planets, it abandons the very idea of reciprocity between ruler and ruled. The citizen gives all and receives nothing but survival until even that is withdrawn. Bahani's story is not about rebellion crushed, nor heresy punished, nor Xenos conquest endured. It is about silence. Silence in the place of memory. Silence where a people once sang of oceans and fruit, where shrines once bore offerings of grain. Silence where no record remains except a single word in a forgotten lexicon. Blue. To reflect on Bahani is to glimpse the Imperium's soul. It is an edifice of glory built upon attrition, sustained by the sacrifice of the nameless. Its triumphs resound across the galaxy, yet its forgotten losses are legion. For every terror, 100 Bahanis. For every Macragga, 1,000 hollowed husks left to famine. The Imperium claims to preserve humanity. Perhaps it does. But what remains preserved is not every life, not every world, not every memory. What endures is the whole. and in the preservation of the whole, the parts may be discarded. That is Bahani's truth, and it is the truth of an empire that will continue until the stars themselves are ashes. Bahani is silent now, but in that silence lies a question none dare answer. How many more such silences must come before even the Imperium itself forgets why it endures?